Nearly a decade after the passing of Merle Haggard, a voice from his past quietly steps forward, bringing with reflection, emotion, and a sense of long-awaited clarity. His wife, Teresa and Lane, offers insight not to reopen old wounds, but to honor a life that was far more complex than the legend the world remembers. Behind the music, behind the fame, there was a man shaped by struggle, resilience, and deeply personal battles that few truly understood. As time has passed, the noise surrounding his legacy has softened, making space for something more honest, and understanding that greatness is never simple, and that even the most celebrated lives carry untold truths. Her words do not seek to change his story, but complete it, reminding us that while the world may remember the icon, those closest to him remember the human being. And it is in that quiet difference that his story finds its deepest meaning. Time as a way of softening even the loudest stories. What once felt immediate and overwhelming slowly becomes quieter, more reflective, and often more honest. For the legacy of Merle Haggard, nearly a decade has passed since his voice fell silent. Yet his presence continues to echo through music, memory, and the lives he touched to the world. He was more than a singer. He was a storyteller, a voice of a generation, and a symbol of raw, unfiltered truth. His songs carried the weight of real experiences, struggles, regrets, resilience, and redemption. But behind the music, behind the persona, there was a life that few truly saw in its entirety. For years after his passing, the public understanding of his life remained largely the same, defined by his career, his influence, and the stories already told. But time creates space for reflection, and reflection often leads to deeper truths. It is within this space that his wife, Teresa Lane, begins to share a more personal perspective. Her voice does not come with urgency or spectacle. It comes quietly, shaped by years of memory, understanding, and the kind of clarity that only time can bring. What she offers is not a revelation meant to shock, but perspective meant to complete the picture. Because no life, no matter how public, is ever fully known from the outside. For Merle Haggard, this truth feels especially important. His life was marked by extremes: success and struggle, fame and hardship, freedom and consequence. These contrasts define not only his music, but the person behind Ari, as his wife reflects on those years. A deeper understanding begins to emerge, one that goes beyond the headlines and into the quieter moments, the moments that never made it into songs or interviews, moments of vulnerability, of reflection, and a humanity that existed behind the image the world saw. There is something powerful in hearing these reflections after so much time has passed. It allows the story to settle, to move beyond immediate emotion, and to be seen with greater perspective. It also allows for honesty, an honesty that may not have been possible before. Her words do not attempt to change how he is remembered. Instead, they add to it. They remind us that even the most iconic figures are shaped by personal experiences that are not always visible. That behind every song, there is a story, and behind every story, there is a person. Another important aspect of this narrative is the idea of legacy. Legacy is often thought of as something fixed, something that remains unchanged after a person is gone. But in reality, it evolves. It grows as new perspectives are shared, as memories are revisited, and as understanding deepens over time. For Merle Haggard, his legacy is not limited to his music. It includes the life he lived, the challenges he faced, and the relationships he built. These elements are just as important as the songs that made him famous. As the story continues, it becomes clear that what is being shared is not a final confirmation in the dramatic sense often suggested by headlines. It is something quieter, but far more meaningful. It is a completion of a story that was never fully told. There is also a sense of emotional closure in this process. Not closure in the sense of ending something, but in the sense of understanding it more fully, of seeing the whole picture rather than just the parts that were visible before. For his wife, this may also be a personal journey, a way of honoring his memory, of sharing what she experienced, and of ensuring that his story is remembered not just as it was seen, but as it was lived. As time continues to pass, these reflections take on even greater significance. They become part of the larger narrative, shaping how future generations will understand him, not just as a musician, but as a human being. And perhaps that is the most important part of the story. Because in the end, what we remember about people is not just what they achieved, but who they were, the choices they made, the challenges they faced, and the way they lived their lives. For Merle Haggard, that life was anything but simple. It was filled with complexity, with moments of difficulty, and with moments of greatness. And it is in that complexity that his true story exists. The passage of time does not erase these complexities. It brings them into focus. It allows them to be seen more clearly, without the distractions of immediacy or emotion. And in that clarity, a deeper understanding emerges, point one that does not diminish his legacy, but strengthens it. One that shows that even the most celebrated lives are shaped by experiences that are both public and private. As the story reaches its final reflection, it leaves behind something simple yet powerful, a reminder that truth is not always immediate, and that understanding often takes time. Because sometimes, it is only after years have passed that the full story can be told. And in that quiet telling, the life of Merle Haggard continues, not just through music, but through memory, reflection, and the voices of those who knew him best as the story continues to unfold. The reflections shared by Teresa and Lane begin to reveal something even more profound, not just about Merle Haggard, but about the nature of memory itself. Memory is never fixed. It evolves, softens, and sometimes brings forward truths that were once too complex to fully understand. In the years following his passing, the world held on to the image it already knew, a legendary voice, a rebellious spirit, and a man whose music spoke directly to the struggles of everyday life. But within the quiet spaces of reflection, a more complete picture begins to take shape, one that is not defined only by success, but by the moments in between. There's a certain honesty that comes with time. It removes the urgency, the need to protect, and the pressure to present things in a certain way. What remains is something more real, something that does not seek approval, but simply exists as truth. And in sharing that truth, Teresa and Lane adds depth to a story that many believe they already understood. For Merle Haggard, life was never a straight path. It was filled with turns, with challenges, and with moments that shaped not only his music, but his character. These experiences were not always visible, yet they were always present, influencing the way he saw the world and the way he expressed it. His music often carried the weight of those experiences. It was not just performance, it was reflection, a reflection of a life lived fully, with all its imperfections and contradictions. And it is these imperfections that made his story so relatable, so human, and so enduring as the narrative continues. It becomes clear that what is being shared now is not meant to redefine him, but to remind us of something important, that no legacy is ever complete without understanding the person behind it. The public sees the result, but the private life holds the journey. For Teresa and Lane, this act of sharing is also an act of preservation. It ensures that his story is not reduced to a simplified version, but remembered in its full complexity. It allows future generations to see him not just as an icon, but as someone who lived, struggled, and grew. There's also a sense of quiet courage in this. Speaking about the past, especially after so much time, requires honesty and strength. It means revisiting memories that are both meaningful and difficult. But in doing so, it creates something lasting, a deeper, more authentic understanding. As time continues to move forward, the world will continue to celebrate his music, his influence, and his contributions. But alongside that celebration, there is now a space for reflection, a space where the full story can exist without simplification, and perhaps that is the most powerful outcome of all, because in the end, the story of Merle Haggard is not just about what he achieved, but about who he was, about the life he lived beyond the stage, beyond the spotlight, and beyond the expectations placed upon him. And as this journey continues to settle into memory, it leaves behind something deeper than confirmation. It leaves behind understanding, and understanding that grows quietly over time, shaping how we remember, how we reflect, and how we connect to the stories of those who came before us. Because sometimes the most important truths are not the ones revealed immediately. They are the ones that emerge slowly, carried forward by time, memory, and the voices of those who choose to share them. As the story moves into its final reflection, the life of Merle Haggard begins to feel less like a legend told in pieces, and more like a complete journey, one that could only be fully understood with time. What once existed as headlines and memories now settles into something quieter, something more meaningful. Through the words of Teresa and Lane, the narrative shifts from what the world believed to what was truly lived. And in that shift, there's a kind of honesty that cannot be recreated. It can only be revealed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, like a story finding its natural ending. There is a powerful truth in the idea that no life is ever fully understood in the moment. It takes distance. It takes reflection. And sometimes it takes the courage of those left behind to share what was once kept private. This is not about changing the past. It is about understanding it more deeply. For Merle Haggard, that deeper understanding brings clarity. It shows a man who was not only shaped by his successes, but by his struggles. A man who lived fully with all the imperfections and contradictions that come with real life. And perhaps that is what makes his story so enduring. Because it is not perfect. It is not simplified. It is real. His music carried that reality. It spoke to people not because it was polished, but because it was honest. And now, years later, that same honesty continues. Not through songs, but through memory and reflection. As the years pass, the need for dramatic revelations fades. What remains is something more lasting, a quiet understanding that grows stronger over time. An understanding that does not rely on headlines or confirmation, but on the truth that slowly reveals itself. For Teresa and Lane, sharing these reflections is not about closing a chapter, but about preserving it, about ensuring that the story is remembered in its full depth, not just in the way it was once seen, but in the way it was truly lived. And in doing so, she gives something back, not just his legacy, but to those who continue to listen, to remember, and to connect with his life and music. As everything gently comes to rest, the story leaves behind a message that is both simple and profound. That time does not erase truth. It reveals it. That memory does not fade. It evolves, and that the lives we think we understand often hold deeper meanings waiting to be discovered. In the end, there is no single moment that defines Merle Haggard. There is no final statement that captures everything he was. Instead, there is a journey, complex, human, and unfinished in the way all meaningful stories are. And in that quiet, unfolding journey, his legacy continues, not just in the music that remains, but in the truths that are still being understood, one reflection at a time. Because some stories are not meant to end. They are meant to be remembered and slowly, deeply understood. And in the quiet space where all stories eventually settle, the life of Merle Haggard no longer feels like something that needs to be explained. It becomes something that is simply felt, not in headlines, not in dramatic revelations, but in the steady understanding that grows over time. Through the reflections of Teresa and Lane, what once seemed distant begins to feel closer, more human, more real. Her words do not attempt to redefine him. They gently complete the picture, adding depth to a life that was always more complex than it appeared. There is a quiet truth in the way time reshapes memory. It removes the noise, the urgency, and the need for certainty, leaving behind something clearer, something honest. And in that honesty, the story of Merle Haggard finds a new kind of meaning, not as a legend placed above others, but as a man who lived fully with all the imperfections and contradictions that come with real life. His music continues to echo, carrying pieces of that life forward. But beyond the songs, beyond the stage, there is something deeper that remains, a legacy built not only on talent, but on experience, struggle, and truth. And perhaps it is what gives his story its lasting power, because it reminds us that no life is ever truly understood in a single moment. It is revealed slowly, through memory, through reflection, and through the voices of those who knew it most closely. As everything gently comes to rest, the idea of finally confirming something begins to feel less important. What matters is not the revelation itself, but the understanding it brings. The way it allows us to see more clearly, to feel more deeply, and to connect more honestly that in the end, the story does not close with certainty. It closes with reflection, the reflection that continues to grow long after the moment has passed. And in that quiet reflection, the legacy of Merle Haggard lives on not just in the music that defined him, but in the truth that continues to unfold one memory at a time. Because some stories are not meant to end with answers. They are meant to remain steady, meaningful, and deeply human, carried forward by time itself. And as the final echoes of the story begin to fade, the life of Merle Haggard stands not as a question to be answered, but as a journey to be understood, slowly, deeply, and without the need for finality. What once seemed like a story waiting for confirmation now feels like something far more meaningful. A life that continues to reveal itself, even in absence. Through the quiet reflections of Teresa and Lane, the narrative transforms. It moves away from the idea of a single truth and towards something richer, a collection of moments, emotions, and experiences that together form a complete, yet ever-evolving picture. Her words do not seek to define him, but to remind us that no person can ever be reduced to a single version of their story. There's a certain stillness that comes with this understanding, a realization that what matters most is not what is finally said, but what continues to be felt. Because even after 9 years, his presence has not disappeared. It has simply changed form. It exists now in memory and music, in the quiet spaces where reflection lives. For Merle Haggard, that presence is carried not only by fans or history, but by those who knew him beyond the stage, those who saw the moments that were never recorded, who experienced a life that existed beyond the public image. And it is through them that his story continues to grow. As time moves forward, the need for dramatic revelations fades into something softer, something more enduring. What remains is understanding, an understanding that is not fixed but fluid, one that deepens with every reflection, every memory, and every story that is shared. And perhaps that is a final truth this journey leaves behind, that a life is never fully captured in its moment, and a legacy is never truly finished. It continues to unfold, shaped by time, by memory, and by the quiet voices that choose to keep it alive. In the end, there is no final answer, only a lasting presence. And in that presence, the story of Merle Haggard endures not as something concluded, but as something ongoing, steady, and deeply human. Because the most powerful stories are not the ones that end with certainty. They are the ones that remain gently unfolding long after the world has stopped asking questions. And when the story finally reaches that quiet place where words begin to fade, the life of Merle Haggard no longer feels like something that needs to be explained. It becomes something that is simply understood, not through headlines, not through final confirmations, but through the slow and steady passage of time that reveals what truly matters. Through the reflections of Teresa and Lane, the distance between the public and the personal begins to disappear. What once felt like a story told from the outside now feels closer, more human, more real. Her words do not bring an ending. They bring depth. They remind us that behind every legend is a life filled with moments that were never meant for the spotlight, yet carry the most meaning. There is something powerful in that realization. That truth does not always arrive in a single moment. It unfolds slowly, shaped by memory, by reflection, and by the courage to share what was once left unspoken. And in that unfolding, the story becomes richer, more complete, not because something new has been revealed, but because something deeper has been understood. For Merle Haggard, that deeper understanding is what now defines his legacy, not just the music that made him a legend, but the life that gave that music its meaning, a life that was complex, imperfect, and real. Just like the stories he told through his songs, as everything gently comes to rest, the idea of a final confirmation fades into something quieter, something more lasting. What remains is not the need for answers, but the presence of understanding, a sense that the story is still alive, still evolving, still being felt. Because in the end, the most meaningful stories are not the ones that give us closure. They're the ones that stay with us. And in that quiet, enduring space, the legacy of Merle Haggard continues, not as something finished, but as something remembered, reflected upon, and carried forward by time itself. Because some lives do not end when the story stops being told. They live on in the meaning we continue to find within them. And in the final stillness, where every story leaves behind its quiet echo, the life of Merle Haggard no longer belongs to headlines or unanswered questions. It belongs to time itself, a time that does not rush, does not demand conclusions, but instead allows meaning to settle slowly, naturally, and truthfully. Through the gentle reflections of Teresa and Lane, what once felt incomplete now feels whole, not because every detail has been explained, but because the story has been allowed to breathe, to exist not as a mystery to solve, but as a life to understand. There's a quiet kind of wisdom in that, the understanding that no life can ever be reduced to a single moment, a single statement, or a single final confirmation. Instead, it is built from countless moments, seen and unseen, remembered and forgotten, that together form something far more meaningful than any one revelation. For Merle Haggard, that meaning lives on in more ways than one. It lives in the music that still plays, carry his voice across generations. It lives in the memories shared by those who knew him, preserving pieces of a life that was never fully visible to the world. And it lives in the understanding that continues to grow, even now, years after his passing. Because time does not erase a legacy. It deepens IT softens the edges, brings clarity to what once felt uncertain, and allows space for reflection that was not possible before. And in that space, the story transforms. It becomes less about what was hidden and more about what was always there, waiting to be understood.